Let us pray. God of endless love, ever caring, ever strong, always present, always just. You gave your only Son to save us by the blood of his cross. Gentle Jesus, shepherd of peace, join to your own suffering the pain of all who have been hurt, in body, mind, and spirit, by those who betrayed the trust placed in them. Hear the cries of our sisters and brothers who have been gravely harmed, and the cries of those who love them. Soothe their restless hearts with hope, steady their shaken spirits with faith. Grant them justice for their cause, enlightened by your truth. Holy Spirit, comforter of our hearts, heal your people's wounds and transform brokenness into wholeness. Grant us the courage and wisdom, humility and grace to act with justice. Breathe wisdom into our hearts and labors. Grant that all harmed by abuse may find peace in justice. We ask all this through Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen. Thank you very much, Kate. Friends, good afternoon. I'm delighted that we're all here together today. It's my pleasure to, I guess I want to say that at the end of our time today, before you leave, I do have a quick announcement related to our preparation for next week's webinar with Dr. Ann Garrido. So please hang a couple minutes longer at the conclusion of the event and let me just talk to you very briefly. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Hilary Jerome Scarsella. Dr. Scarsella is the Assistant Director of Ethics and Director of Women and Gender Studies in Church and Society at the Colgate-Rochester Crozer Divinity School in Rochester, New York. In addition, she is the Director of Theological Integrity at Into Account, a nonprofit offering support and advocacy for survivors and allies seeking justice, accountability, and recovery in Christian contexts. As I think all of you are aware, Into Account has had a pivotal role in documenting David Haas's abuses and working to support survivors' call for accountability and transformation. Throughout this case, it has been Dr. Scarsella's role at Into Account to advise ministers, liturgists, hymnal editors, and sacred music publishers on what the Haas case means for their work and worship going forward. Dr. Scarsella's academic training is in theology, liturgy, trauma, and sexual violence. So she brings to the Into Account team both direct advocacy for survivors and a perspective that pays close attention to the ways that theologies and worship embody expressions of Christian faith that resist or perpetuate systems of sexual violence in the church and in society more broadly. Her MDiv is from the Anabaptist Mennonite Biblical Seminary, and her MA and Ph.D. are from Vanderbilt University. As painful as these revelations have been to all of us, they pale in comparison to the pain of Haas's victims, pain that's been present to them for years while most of their voices were either silenced or ignored. We are grateful to Into Account and Dr. Scarsella for having been instrumental in changing the narrative of this freedom journey, a course correction from perhaps a privileged fantasy to actual stories of human liberation. With gratitude and hope, I am delighted to introduce to you Dr. Hilary Scarsella.
Thank you very much. I'm really excited to be here with you all this afternoon. So yes, I am a seminary professor in ethics and women and gender studies, and I also am a director at Into Account. And as Rory so helpfully described, my role there is really to act as a Christian ethicist and theologian, to think with survivors and bear witness to the parts of survivors' stories where religion and abuse are tangled, where theology and worship and sexual violence cannot be easily pulled apart. And so in this particular case of David Haas's abuses, an absolutely huge part of what has created harm is the entanglement of theology, of worship, of sacred music, and of sexual violence. My understanding is that you all are a community for whom that particular entanglement is especially painful, given your callings and your work and your investment in the worship and industry of sacred music. So my hope for our conversation today, and I do hope for it to be a conversation, is that one, we gain an understanding of what it means to approach sexual violence with a survivor-centered response. So one thing I want to do is really talk about what this term survivor-centered means and how it applies for the kind of conversations that you all are going to be having with each other going forward. And then a second thing that I want to do is I want to have a conversation with you that actually models and practices survivor-centered reflection on what kind of claim survivors' testimonies make on your community as liturgical composers. So first, a word about Into Account. I expect this will be review for many of you at this point, but Into Account is a national 501c3 nonprofit. We provide advocacy and resources to survivors who are seeking accountability, particularly in Christian communities of faith. We strategize on holding institutions, perpetrators, and enablers accountable for violence, harms, and cover-ups. And when I say accountable, what I mean is a kind of rich, holistic form of accountability. So we recognize that the criminal justice system is not built to bear witness to survivors' experiences of real, actual sexual violence. The percentage of experiences of sexual violence that actually make it to court, I believe is under 1%. And the percentage of cases that are able to reach conviction, even though they are cases in which sexual violence did in fact occur, is similarly small. And so we have a legal system that doesn't work for sexual violence, and oftentimes actually re-inflicts the trauma of sexual violence on survivors. So we recognize that Into Account that if we are wanting communities of justice, and if we are wanting communities of mutual, just, good, healthy, right relationship, in and outside of the church, we have to get creative about how we are bearing witness to survivor stories and how we are coming up with options for holding those who enable and perpetrate sexual violence accountable for their behavior. Accountability for us does not necessarily or automatically mean jail. Right? Accountability means being confronted with the truth of the harm one has caused and being asked and then held accountable for making restitution for that harm, as well as the community coming together to not allow for that harm to continue and be repeated again. So again, goals for today are understanding what it means to talk about a survivor-centered approach to sexual violence, and then also modeling and practicing survivor-centered reflection on the kind of claim that survivors' testimonies, particularly survivors' testimonies to experiences of abuse by David Haas, make on your community as liturgical composers. I want to acknowledge that I don't know much about the individuals who are here. I haven't had the opportunity to get to know you in a personal way. But if I'm just thinking in terms of statistics, in a group this size, it is statistically probable that in our digital space with us today, there are people here who are survivors. It is probable that there are people in our space today who have been allies to survivors. It is also probable that there are people in our conversation today who have been enablers of sexual violence. And statistically, again, it is probable that there are people in our space today who are themselves people who have perpetrated sexual violence. We need to acknowledge, in order to have this conversation honestly and well, that we are inhabiting a complex space. Every time we talk about sexual violence, this is true, not just here today in this forum, but every time we talk about sexual violence, we are talking about it in the presence of survivors, in the presence of allies, in the presence of enablers, and in the presence of perpetrators. And those identities are not fixed, right? It's possible for someone to be a survivor and an enabler. It's possible for someone to be an ally and a survivor. So the fact that one has behaved in a way that is enabling in one particular instance does not mean that that is kind of a fixed identity that can never be changed about that person. So acknowledging that this is complex space, I also want to say that this is a space today of solidarity with survivors. It's a space of challenge insofar as it takes work, sometimes painful work, to practice solidarity with survivors. As this is a space of solidarity with survivors, it's also a space for learning. So it's okay if you don't know very much about sexual violence. It's okay if you make mistakes. I want you to bring your full selves into this space of learning because learning is absolutely constitutive to making progress along the path of solidarity. So as I say that, I want you all to notice whether there is tension that comes up for you when I say that we are in the presence of survivors, we are in the presence of enablers, we are in the presence of perpetrators. Hold each of those kind of positions, perhaps even close your eyes. Notice whether you are feeling tension in your shoulders or in your head. Perhaps you're not feeling tension. Perhaps it feels like relief to have it named that we are in complex company. However it feels for you to hold this complex space, bring your mind there and just take a couple of breaths. As you do that, do whatever you need to do to acknowledge what complexity means for you in this space. Affirm for yourself that this conversation is not one in which you need to be on the defense. This space, complex as it is one in which you are invited to be a learner. And if you have experience in the topics that we are talking about, it is also one in which I invite you to share your wisdom with us. Okay. So, a survivor-centered response. I think actually, do I have the ability to share my screen? Host, I do not have the ability to share my screen. If you can give me that power, that would be lovely, but it's not the end of the world if you can't. So a survivor-centered response has at least 3 basic steps. Oh, we're good to go? Great. Okay, all good?
It's good.
Great. So a survivor-centered response has at least 3 steps. The first one is about learning, seeking to learn, actively pursuing learning. The second one is about choosing verbal and embodied responses or actions. And the third is about critical self-reflection. So constantly noticing and interrogating thoughts that come up for you that might derail you from success in steps 1 and 2. So step 1, seek to learn. When we learn that someone has come forward with an experience of sexual violence, whether we know that person or it is a story we hear in the news. If it's important for us to engage that story, the first step is to actively pursue learning, first of all, about the survivor's experiences. So insofar as a survivor is willing to share, wants to share about what happened to them, the important first step is to create space within oneself to be attentive to what those experiences were. The next thing we need to learn about is the impact of the perpetrator's actions on the survivors. Sometimes survivors are willing to talk about the impact, even as there aren't a whole lot of details of the actual experience. Impact is just as important to learn about as the experiences themselves. So learn about experiences, learn about the impact of the perpetrator's actions on the survivors, and then make an effort to learn about survivors' wishes for how communities of faith or how communities where the abuse is at issue move forward. It's important in this learning phase to be mindful of any kinds of thoughts or questions or anxieties that would threaten to derail the learning process. And not to shut down those questions or anxieties, but I often tell folks to invite those anxieties to kind of sit in a box on the shelf. You can tend to them, but the focus of learning about survivors' experiences should not have to compete with the kinds of questions and anxieties that perhaps are demanding more of your attention. So learn about survivors' experiences, learn about the impact of the perpetrator's actions on survivors, learn about survivors' wishes for how the communities that you are engaged in move forward, and then actively seek to learn about and reflect on the power that you individually or the communities that you are a part of have to use this moment of your increased knowledge about the reality of abuse to interrupt the dynamics of sexual violence. So we can't jump in a time machine and undo it, but every individual and every community has power to engage survivors' experiences of sexual violence in a way that makes it less likely that the trauma and harm of that violence will be exacerbated, and more likely that sexual violence will come to an end in these communities. So what kind of power do you have to make your community safer? What kind of power does your community have to add to survivors' empowerment? What kind of power does your community have to build stronger solidarity with survivors? These are questions that you can learn about by asking survivors. Perhaps survivors will have responses they want to share, but there are also questions that require critical self-reflection, which is the direction that we are moving. The next step after this learning process is to actually choose verbal and embodied responses that draw on your knowledge of A and B. So draw on what you've learned about survivors' experiences and the impact of the perpetrator's actions on survivors in order to enact the knowledge you have gained about C and D, meaning the knowledge you have gained about how survivors want you to move forward, giving your new knowledge of their abusive experiences, and what kind of power you or your community have to actually create conditions that resist sexual violence going forward. In addition to these actions, as I have been saying, a third important step to a survivor-centered response to sexual violence is to constantly notice and interrogate thoughts that come up to threaten to decenter survivors from your processes of learning and action. I want to pause there for a second just to allow questions of clarification about the general sort of framework of this process. And then I want to talk about some common anxieties that do often threaten to distract us from a survivor-centered process so that we can kind of practice what it looks like to interrogate them.
Just as a
Feel free.
reminder to ask questions, either raise your hand, put it into chat, or better yet, put it into the Q&A panel.
Yes, so someone has asked, very rightly so, that we establish that before we share in this admittedly complex space, it's important that we also establish what kind of confidentiality is expected in this space. And that's really tricky. So I don't know what kind of relationships you all have with each other. I don't know how comfortable each of you feels trusting that this is space where what is shared will not go beyond our walls. So I want to encourage and empower each of you to make that decision for yourself. It is absolutely my recommendation that any request for confidentiality be respected as long as it is a request that is to survivors' benefit. So for example, when I'm dealing with issues of confidentiality, if somebody says to me, I want you to hold in confidence that I have hurt this other person, my answer is no. I'm not going to hold that in confidence because it is not just for me to hold that in confidence, at least given my role as a survivor advocate, right? If someone comes to me and says, I have a really complicated situation and I want to speak to you about it in confidence because not having confidence would make the situation worse, then of course I say, yes, let's talk. So I encourage here for survivor-centered confidence to be kept if anyone requests it. So make that request known in your own verbal expression if you'd like. If you would feel more comfortable sharing your question or your comment just with the panelists, that would be me and Rory and Tony Ward, you can do that by adding your question to the Q&A rather than speaking. Another person asked if it would be possible to have a copy of the materials that I'm using on screen share, and yes, I can send those to Rory to send out to all of you. So questions, that said, about the structure of what I have presented here as a survivor-centered process. Okay, if they come up for you, feel free to add them to the Q&A and I will come back when I have a minute to take a pause. So I'm gonna go back and share that screen again. Okay, so what do I mean when I say notice and interrogate thoughts that come up that threaten to decenter survivors from your process? Here are some common anxieties. I think that they will probably resonate with ones that you have heard. What if the allegations are false? This was an anxiety that was absolutely expressed with respect to David Haas and is expressed with respect to just about every other perpetrator of sexual violence that, at least on all of the cases that I have worked in. What if the allegations are false? What if a survivor-centered response ruins this man's career? So what if I believe a survivor? What if I take a survivor's claim seriously and it ends up having an unjust, disastrous effect on this person's life? Aren't Christians obligated to forgive sinners rather than carry out judgment against them? What about all of the people who are meaningfully connected to the perpetrator's music or work or intellectual life or theology? Aren't we hurting them if we stop singing it, if we stop using it? What about all of the good that this man or this person has done? Humans are complicated. This is a complex space. Each individual person is a complex person. What do we do with all of the good that a person who has behaved in sexually violent ways has done at other times? Why not separate the artist from his art? It can't be right to give up art, music, or ideas that have done so much good in the world just because the person who created them has behaved in sexually violent ways. So what I want to point out about these questions is that survivors have disappeared from our focus when we ask them. If you look at these questions, you will notice that we are no longer thinking about the person who has been harmed. We we actually don't have to engage a survivor at all in order to answer the questions that are here. So these are questions that distract from a survivor-centered process precisely because they take the survivor out of the center of our gaze. They're questions that beckon us to look another direction. Here are some ways that I would suggest that we can engage these questions when they come up for us that moves us back into a survivor-centered frame. So it's not that there is no value whatsoever to talking about some of the real issues that are underneath these questions, but oftentimes these questions and anxieties come up not because a person is really, genuinely striving to find the right answer to the question, but because asking these questions allows a person to escape the difficult work of actually coming to terms with the testimonies of violence that they are hearing. So here are some responses that move us back into a survivor-centered frame. What if the allegations are true? Seriously, what if these allegations that you're hearing before Into Account's report comes out, before there has been a legal case, et cetera, what if it's true? What if this person who has power and influence in your community is actually committing acts of sexual violence in ways that are hurting other people in your community? If that's true, what would your responsibility be in that case? What happens to survivors if we don't center them in our response? So if the anxiety question moving us out of a survivor-centered frame is what if a survivor's response ruins this person's career, moving survivors back into the center of the frame asks, okay, well, what happens to survivors if they are not centered in the way that we choose to respond to the allegation? So what are the risks? Some of you may have seen that I put out a response this morning to the I Am Mine series written by one of Haas's survivors. And in that response, one of the things that I observed was that the survivor who wrote that series helped us see so clearly what happens when we don't have a survivor-centered frame. And what happens and happened in this case is that teenagers and women who tried to come forward to raise concerns about Haas's more grooming behaviors, less overtly violent, but still like behaviors that were pushing boundaries in an unhealthy way, when they came forward to ask questions about that, the community basically told them, oh, he's just like that. That's just the way he is. Don't worry about it. What happens to survivors if we don't center them in our responses is that we fail to see the violence that they are struggling to survive. And when we fail to see it, we fail to be people of faith who can step in its way. If the decentering question is, aren't Christians obligated to forgive sinners rather than carry out judgment against them? The question that recenters survivors and still focuses on that theological subject is, what would a theology of forgiveness look like that actually has a chance to stop sexual violence? So if forgiveness is this concept that is constantly putting survivors at risk of increased harm, and if it seems impossible for us to reconcile our understanding of what forgiveness is with what survivors are telling us they need in order for sexual violence to stop and in order to feel that their communities are communities that are actually standing with them against sexual harm, how do we have to reconceive of our understanding of forgiveness so that forgiveness is not at odds anymore with the needs of survivors? I have a really hard time believing that a theological concept so central to the Christian faith could possibly be a theological concept that God intends to be used in a way that disempowers survivors and enables sexual violence. It is much more likely to me that we human beings have failed to grasp the nuances and failed to understand the full meaning of what the divine concept of forgiveness is intended to be if we are employing it in ways that hurt people who have been sexually violated. So rather than having anxiety about aren't Christians obligated to forgive sinners, the question that we really need to be grappling with that also centers survivors is, what would a theology of forgiveness look like that stops sexual violence? What kind of hurt do we inflict if we continue singing the music? The decentering question is, what about all the people who are meaningfully connected to the perpetrator's music? Aren't we hurting them if we stop singing it? To recenter the one who has endured the most intense pain because of the perpetrator's violence, what we need to be asking ourselves is, what kind of hurt do we ourselves actually inflict on survivors if we continue singing this music, and who carries the burden of that pain? I want to tell one little anecdote. Right after news of Haas's violence became public, the question of what our church is going to do with this music, are communities of faith going to keep singing it, was really hot. It still is, but it was an especially brutally painful question for survivors to hear at the time. And I'm not just talking about Haas's survivors, I'm talking about all survivors, survivors across the whole entire country, survivors who were abused by their brothers, survivors who were abused by their priests. I mean, you name it. Any survivor who had experienced sexual violence in a way that felt in any way similar whatsoever to the testimonies of harm that they were hearing from Haas's survivors were in deep re-traumatized pain over hearing their own congregations hundreds of miles away wrestle with the question of, what do we do with this music? Because for survivors, not every single one, I don't want to put all survivors in a box, but for many, many survivors, it's just such a no-brainer that the fact you have to experience your community really struggling with the question just shows survivors how little the people who they rely on as their community of faith understand the harm that they have lived. So, what kind of hurt do we inflict if we keep singing this music, and who carries the burden of that pain? To the distracting question of, what about all of the good this person has done, we move back into a survivor frame by asking ourselves, who's responsible for the complication, the corruption, or the loss of the good that this person has done? The answer to that question is always the person who inflicted violence. So I like to talk about this as another level of betrayal that the perpetrator has committed, not only against the direct survivors, but against everyone who has an attachment to the good that they previously associated with that person. So the person who decides to behave in violent ways is responsible for corrupting and creating a loss with respect to their own good that they have done in the world. And just as survivors experience grief and loss when a mentor who they looked up to and respected turns out to be someone willing to take advantage of them, so too does the whole entire community of faith experience grief and a loss when the person who offered a gift that was spiritually meaningful in their life has also ruined that gift for them. And our last decentering question, what kind of hurt do we inflict? Oh, nope, I'm sorry. Our last decentering question is, why not separate the artist from his art? It can't be right to give up art, music, or ideas that have done so much good in the world just because a person who created them behaved in sexually violent ways. And the way to recenter ourselves back into a survivor-centered process is to respond to that question internally with the question, what kind of relationship between the artist and the art persists for survivors regardless of our own choice? How does our choice impact survivors? So I'm going to stop screen sharing. Hold on. So abuse and sexual violence is a little bit like a pool of water where there's a pebble and there is a point of impact and ripples kind of go out from there. Abuse is not a situation that only involves the individual perpetrator and the individual survivors, even though that is where the intensity of the violence and the intensity of our focus ought to be. Even so, one perpetrator's abuse creates harm and grief and trauma throughout the entire community of their influence and connection. But those of us who are on the periphery, those of us who are not as emotionally impacted by the abuse, have more of an option than those at the center for how we continue to relate the perpetrator to the gifts that the perpetrator has given, right? So in this case, how we relate David Haas, the person who behaved in sexually violent ways, with the hymns that David Haas wrote that have had a spiritual importance in our personal lives. People who are at the center of the pool usually literally do not have any option to make a decision in that capacity because the connection between the two, between the music and the person, is a traumatic connection and it's a visceral connection. Trauma in the brain involves a kind of crossing of wires that links sensory input and emotional input with, memory isn't quite the right word. I would say memory of the actual violence itself, except that when we usually talk about the word memory, we're talking about an experience that we're very conscious happened in the past. Whereas traumatic memory, the brain has stored that memory in a different place entirely and has stored it as if it is still happening in the present. So rather than remembering something in the past, a survivor re-experiences the past in the present. And the re-experiencing of the past is literally linked with neurons in their brains with the name of the person and the music the person wrote and what it smelled like in the room, et cetera, et cetera. So if a person's community of faith decides that their brains have the capacity to separate the artist from the art, they can go on and not be disturbed, continuing to engage that art without bringing back the traumatic memory of the artist's violence. But those who are most impacted by that violence literally do not have that option. And so when their communities make the choice to make that separation, the communities send the message back to the survivors that they are more concerned about preserving their own love of the art than they are about creating a community space in which survivors are respected, understood, and welcomed. So again, to recenter survivors from the decentering question of can't we separate the art from the artist, we ask ourselves instead the question, who can separate the art from the artist, and what kind of harm will I myself impose on survivors all around me if I choose to move that direction? I'm going to pause here again and invite reflections, questions, anything that has come up for you that you would like to say or process.
Hi. Do I speak?
Yes, go for it.
Yeah.
Hi. I'm really glad to hear you speak about the difference between people who do not know anything about the people who are involved in the situation in our communities, and the difference between people whose brains, who have been affected directly by any kind of abuse, and but particularly in this situation, with regard to the things that can trigger a memory, can trigger an experience, can trigger a trauma that only a survivor can really understand. It's very difficult for those in our communities who may not have any personal experience of this, of abuse, to understand really why the elimination of potential triggers is really necessary. I'm really glad to hear you talk about the difference between that person's brain as opposed to the other person's brain, and how that it's not just about like in as I hear in the media sometimes, or in the way people talk about the abused. It's so easy to fall into the trap of trying to normalize or even dismiss the experience of abused person because of what you might know about either the character or personality of that person, the tendency to maybe want to seek attention or to satisfy some sort of personal professional desire that they had that was ultimately or may not have been received for any particular reason. I'm kind of getting mixed up and complicated here, but I'm really glad to hear you talk about the differences between the two types of brain, because I think we get enmeshed also in the motives or the agenda of people, whether it's the abuser and or the abused, and how that comes across in making choices, and you know.
Yes. Yeah. And what often happens, or at least we are culturally primed to get lost and stressed and confused, and to allow ourselves to spend all of our energy spinning our wheels trying to figure out who's trustworthy, and what the facts are. Did it happen? Did it not happen? How do we know it happened? And that anxiety about exactly knowing the truth is, by my perspective, another way to let ourselves off the hook for pursuing a survivor-centered process. Because, you know, the reality is that there are very, very few situations in which any one of us will ever have access to knowing exactly the truth in the way that we are wanting to know it, which is a kind of, with scientific and absolute comprehension, right? And I think that's really interesting, especially for Christians, because Christians celebrate the fact that some of the richest truths cannot be scientifically measured. That belief is not only about knowing historically and factually exactly the sequence of events as they happened, but that belief in what matters has to do with an orientation toward the world, has to do with a commitment to justice, and with getting comfortable with the limitations of our knowledge, right? That's what Christians have to do. The gospel accounts conflict with each other. Well, we have limitations to our knowledge. We don't know what happened in between this moment and this moment in Jesus's life. Well, we have to be comfortable with the limits of our knowledge. What our belief is in is not the absolute nitty-gritty historical specifics of the testimony of Christ. What our belief is in is the witness to the reality, right? The reality of God in the world. And I think Christians have an opportunity to take all of that skill we have in approaching belief as a rich concept and saying, no, we need to use that concept of belief when we are listening to survivors. We need to say, what orientation to the world is demanded of me right now in the wake of a human being's claim that they have experienced one of the worst things that a person can experience? If I get caught up and distracted by all kinds of other questions that take me away from the truth and the pain that that person is telling, that's me getting wrapped up in the culture that does not want me to take their voice seriously. Sorry, there were more people who wanted to talk. I saw next Kate B.
I should have asked if you could hear me first. Can you hear me?
Oh, yes.
Now we can.
Yes.
I have to, sorry, I was talking for 30 seconds. This is sort of piggybacks on that. My question is, as people are sharing these, the first thing was learn the stories, read the stories, learn the stories. This is a very personal thing, but it is very difficult for me to read those stories. I feel that there is, you know, it's like when you have a small child and you don't want them to see certain things because it can't be unseen once it's seen. And so there's a large part of me that wants that just feels like I need to protect myself from the damage that can be done to me, knowing my own personal circumstances. Do I need to know the specifics in order to support? That's my question.
That's a really good question. And I think there are a few different answers depending on the circumstances of the person who's asking it. So I won't ask you to disclose, but I'll just speak in general to a few different situations. There are situations in which somebody who has similarly traumatic experiences, like another survivor, would make a wise choice by not reading and dwelling in every single other story of survivors who are out there. So to the extent that a person is protecting themselves from more unjust harm coming to them by way of dwelling in trauma, totally affirm, set boundaries for sure. If we're talking about a person who does not have that experience, feels sad and broken and grief and devastated by learning about other people's experiences, and wants to distance from the stories because it disrupts kind of your ability to continue to like have a life that is not affected by a survivor's suffering, then I would say no. It's not useful for anybody to destroy themselves by sitting in traumatic stories all the time. But it is absolutely critical that people engage these stories to the extent that they need to in order to bear witness in their life and their action and their decisions to survivors' realities. So if you can do that without reading every word of every survivor's story, that is one thing. But if you need the education, or if you are in a position where you are one of those survivor circles of support, or you have some kind of responsibility with respect to the situation, then I would say struggle through.
Dr. Scarsella, I would also urge you to take a look at the question that is in the Q&A right now too, if this is an appropriate time.
Yeah, I was just reading that. So there's a question about, that in some circumstances, canceling concerts for Haas also meant that money wasn't able to be raised for people who were in economic hardship. And what do we do when the causes of different people who are suffering are in conflict? Do we always, is the choice always binary?
Yeah, I want to just interrupt because I know the situation here. It was not a concert this is about what I would call collateral damage, where Haas Associates, in our group, the Composers Forum, was doing a series of concerts to benefit laid off church musicians. And basically the story is that people who were sympathetic to survivors and survivors themselves threatened to flood the concert information with the hashtag shame thing, which basically caused that the concert had to be canceled, and it was not directly related to Haas except through people's suspicions that some people knew more than they did. You know what I mean? So this is, I think the question is about, as he says there, or she says, I don't even know, what's the word? Well, yeah, I guess you kind of get the idea. This is like a sort of an indirect about collateral damage
Sure.
from the thing. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's important to recognize that these things they're messy.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just like, you know, the Black Lives Matter protests are messy.
Right.
It is, I think, has become really clear that one kind of down low way of expressing white supremacy and racism is to say, well, I support Black Lives Matters, but I don't support the riots, to distance oneself from any kind of collateral damage that there might be from a movement for justice. And I would say the same thing here. If survivors are concerned about a concert, if survivors are feeling that a concert is not respecting their testimonies, that it's inappropriate, that it causes them harm in some way, that concert needs to be rethought, re-envisioned, or canceled, and it needs to be done so voluntarily by the organizers. Survivors shouldn't have to threaten hashtags. If they're threatening hashtags, that means that what you're doing is causing them a lot of pain, even if you don't see it, which is why the survivor-centered process starts with seeking to learn. Because I'm not talking about seeking to learn, like just read the survivor story and find out the facts of what happened. I mean, recognize that you probably don't really have a clue when it comes to what happened in this person's life and how it is connected to any of the work that you are doing. So seeking to learn means stop. It means stop, listen to survivors, pay very special attention to anything that you are doing that is causing discomfort or exacerbating the situation in a negative way, and take survivors' lead about what you should do in order to mitigate that harm, regardless of whether or not you understand the reason. Because chances are, especially if there is a whole group of folks who are survivors and allies saying this needs to change, chances are they are correct. And if they're not correct, your resistance to hearing their voices will in itself be a violation, even if you think you had good reasons. And yes, I would say the collateral damage to the people who were not able to get money that they needed is absolutely that. It's collateral damage. However, the collateral damage is the responsibility of the person who perpetrated harm. So that's David Haas's responsibility. He sabotaged that event. His behavior created a situation in which that money could not be raised. That is not collateral damage that ought to be considered on the shoulders of or the responsibilities of survivors who came forward to say that what you were doing was painful. That would be my response there.
That's terrific. Thanks for your answer. Thank you.
Yeah. So I want to flip now over to another document because we've been talking a lot in general about what a survivor response is. And I want to also make space in our time together to acknowledge that there is a very particular relationship between sexual violence and liturgy and song and theology that we are dealing with in this case. So some of you may have read the I Am Mine series that had parts 1, 2, and 3 put out this week by one of the survivors. In that series, she reveals that after David Haas sexually assaulted her and when she was starting to kind of move toward coming forward and confronting him about that, giving him signals that she was not comfortable remaining silent, he wrote her a psalm. And the the message of the psalm very clearly to her and to my reading as well, is stay quiet. And then in her story, she also recomposed a psalm in response, that I think had the liturgical power of undoing the hold that Haas's psalm intended to have over her. So I have put those side by side, and I'm going to bring it up. Okay, so on the left is the psalm that Haas wrote in an attempt to silence the survivor. And on the right, in black text, is the survivor's psalm of response. I'm not going to read the blue text because I think that liturgy has power and prayer has power. And I don't want to give these words vocal space in which to do the work that they were designed to do. So I'm going to read silently, and I'm going to ask that each of you read the blue text silently as well, and then we'll talk about it. Okay. I would like for you to put into the chat any observations you have about what words, what phrases in this psalm are silencing. Just lift them up for us, and then as you lift them up, I'll offer some commentary. Do you see in this psalm any way that the language of faith is being used to silence? Yes. So they never silence with their, or they never slander with their tongue. They never slander with their tongue. Slander here bringing to mind the idea of speaking about the survivor's experience. So the faithful, the pure of heart, they never speak ill. The next line, nor harm their friends. They never slander with their tongue. They never harm their friends. Certainly don't harm their mentors. Certainly don't harm or slander or speak ill of one who is considered a pillar of faith in the community. The theological message here is the pure of heart, those who are the pure faithful of God, they do not speak ill of their friends. What else do we have in the chat here? Who can rest? Yes. Defend, protect. To God they keep their word. Yes, absolutely. So they do not slander with their tongue nor harm their friends. What they have to say remains between them and God. To God they keep their words. They rebuke the godless, perhaps law enforcement and the media, certainly. Those with integrity who do what is right. So integrity here, by pairing this idea of integrity and doing what is right with the notions of not slandering and not harming, keeping their word, defending their integrity, wrapping all of those together suggests that doing what is right and doing what has integrity in the eyes of God is refraining from allowing your own hurt and your own pain and your own experiences to move from yourself into the public square or into a community that might be able to do something about it. They who are not me, they honor those who believe. Yes. Yes, thank you for all of this. So by themselves, right, these words are not inherently bad. There's nothing inherently bad about the concept of the pure of heart. But when you take the concept of the pure of heart and you invoke the way that perhaps the purity of Mary has been used, especially in the Catholic tradition, as a kind of chastening of expressions of being a woman that do not conform to a modest ideal, then just using that term, pure of heart, invokes a whole entire theological history and a whole kind of claim about what it means to be a good woman. Same thing with slander. I'm seeing more comments here. Don't tell, don't feel, don't talk. Yes. There's a kind of silencing and choosing the Matthew Beatitudes and combining them with Psalm 15. Both advocate a passivity and a glass house mindset. Yes. So the kind of explicit argument doesn't need to be made, because when you're dealing with liturgy and when you're dealing with the biblical text, you all know so well that with one phrase, you invoke an entire spirituality, an entire kind of outlook on the world. And if you are skilled in doing that, you can invoke ideas and themes and arguments that are imbued with divine richness, and you can piece them together in a way that will create a sense for a survivor that they must be quiet, without that survivor even really consciously being able to articulate what it was that the person who wrote that psalm or song or prayer did wrong. So there is a power in liturgy. And it's a neutral power. It's a power that you all know so well can be used to increase justice and faith and righteousness in the world. But because it's a power that can be used, it can be used to do what the person using it wants. And so I think you all have a special opportunity and a special responsibility to be on guard for the ways that your craft is being used to interact with survivors, intentionally or not. I want to now read out loud the psalm of response that the survivor wrote, and pay special attention. If you can kind of be scanning the blue text while I'm reading for the words that she decided to change, I think that will be eye-opening for us. Blessed are those who call and fight for righteousness, they shall see God. God, who can storm the gates of hell? Who can rest on your mountain after 19 long years? Those with integrity, who do what is right, speaking truth with great courage. Blessed are those who call and fight for righteousness, they shall see God. They tell the truth with great risk. They uphold their good friends. They rebuke those who abuse. They honor those who survived. They vow to fight for them and defend their stories with strength and protection. Blessed are those who call and fight for righteousness. They shall see God. They do nothing out of selfish gain. They cast down every demon. These are the pure ones. And we, 44 strong, will stand forever, unshaken, unshaken. Using your liturgical and musical sensibilities, offer into the chat your observations about how the survivor is using the positive power of liturgy in order to transform the conditions of abuse that Haas created for her. Thank you, Tony Barr, for your observation in the chat as well. So what do you see in the survivor's psalm that undoes the harm of Haas's? She's reversing the manipulation that was in the blue text to liberating text in the black. Right, so insofar as the blue text is emphasizing quietness, The Black text is emphasizing speaking the truth with great courage. We have language like storming, storming the gates of hell, fighting for righteousness, calling out, much more active language, language that is engaging the community rather than turning inward. It's very strong and gratifying to see purity of heart recess as the struggle for justice. Yes. She refuses to accept the notion that God wants our passivity. Amen. It is the voice of the oppressed, which is evangelizing us. Yes. Yes, absolutely. And notice, I called attention to the phrase pure of heart used in the blue text. That was the first thing the survivor changed. Blessed are the pure of heart, they shall see God, they shall see God. She says, no, blessed are those who call and fight for righteousness, they shall see God. And so there is an acknowledgement right away that this phrase, pure of heart, even though there's nothing inherently wrong with it, that the way it is used in the left side, the blue side of the text, is disempowering. That pure of heart is being used to create the image of a godly person or a godly woman that actually directly opposes what God wants for women and for all of us, which is the liberation of the oppressed. So rather than pure of heart, she said, blessed are those who call and fight for righteousness. She's reinterpreting what pure of heart means. To be pure in the eyes of God, she says, we call out and we fight for righteousness' sake. In the chat, I see they honor those who survived, vow to fight for them. Yes. A mirror of the very same tools of manipulation as the response, holding perpetrator responsible for that use. From the outset, she's describing the courageous heart speaking out. Theologically horizontal, not vertical, absolutely. Yes, and the observation that pure of heart in the blue text stands as cliche, is in need of exegesis, which I would argue is precisely what she has offered. An exegesis of resistance to the way that that theological concept was used in the blue text. Okay, thank you for joining me in that exercise. What I hope to have lifted up is that a part of the power that you all have to engage and resist sexual violence is to draw attention to the way that the church's music and the church's prayer is or is not conscious of its impact on survivors, but not only on survivors, with respect to the ways that sexual violence is systemically perpetuated. Because it's one thing for this prayer to be written by Haas to an actual survivor. We can see very clearly in that case that the language and the way the theology is put together in a way that disempowers. But we also live in a culture, in a society, and we have inherited a whole entire Western tradition of Christian faith that has systemically, historically, dramatically disempowered women and children and been explicitly, insistently not conscious of the situation of abuse and sexual violence. And so that means that we are at risk of writing psalms and prayers and songs precisely like the one that Haas wrote and sent to this survivor without even having the notion of sexual violence in our minds. And we are at risk that a survivor in a church somewhere is going to pick that up and internalize the same message of being silenced that this survivor got from this particular psalm. So there is work to be done around understanding how phrases and images and melodies and theological concepts lifted from the biblical text interact with survivors' experiences of abuse, and with what it means to create cultures in our communities of faith now that open opportunities for increased resistance. That is a call that I would like to give to you. So in our last bit of time together, I want to go back to the first document that I shared, the steps in a survivor-centered response. You will see, if I can pull it up again. Okay. So I want to come back to step one, seeking to learn. We talked about learning about survivors' experiences. We talked about learning about the impact of a perpetrator's actions on survivors and about survivors' wishes for how your community responds. I want to spend some time thinking with you in Truth and Power about what kind of power your community has to use this moment of revelation about Haas's abuses to make your community safer, to interrupt systemic dynamics of sexual violence, to empower survivors, and to increase your community's ability to act in solidarity with survivors now and going forward. So I invite you to sit with those questions and either enter into the chat or raise your hand and offer some observations about the power that this particular community does have to make positive changes going forward. Where are the opportunities? Difficult question. Yeah, so it's not so much a question of banning his music, but of proactively finding positive substitutes which promote growth and awareness of truth. So what I hear in that response is you all have power over what kind of music gets noticed and gets created to a certain extent. I'm not saying you have all the power that there is, but a power that you do have is to influence music. So in your gatherings of the Liturgical Composers Forum, you can give more space to these discussions rather than just focusing on composing skills. You can focus on the issue of representation, certainly. What else? Yeah, so you can recognize that a survivor-centered lens is a different lens to look through in a composing or when setting a text. Feel free to keep entering things if you like. I have some ideas of other places where your group may have some power. So one area where you all have some power is that you have the power to name failures. It has become clear that Haas was able to perpetrate his violence not because he is a mastermind of abuse, and certainly the responsibility falls on him quite a bit. And yet, like we've been talking about, abuse happens in community. It is not just between individuals. So there are likely ways that individuals, you as individuals, or you as a community, or the broader kind of culture of liturgical composers in the West has failed when it comes to understanding sexual violence and when it comes to supporting survivors, when it comes to creating music that is conscious of sexual violence as a justice issue and as an issue of faith. And there is power in naming failures. This is not the power of naming failures for me, from my perspective as a survivor advocate. It is not about a kind of overly emotional contrition. In fact, that is counterproductive and unhelpful. The power in naming failures is that doing the work to identify, name, and take responsibility for failures is work that affirms that the reality that survivors are telling is actually real. So when sexual violence happens, what happens for survivors and what a lot of the trauma is for survivors is that the world in which everyone is living, in which the perpetrator is safe and good, and a model of faith, gets ripped away from them. And all of a sudden they find themselves living on another planet, absolutely alone. Everybody else continues on this normal planet over here where they were 5 minutes ago, but they now are by themselves on a planetary island. And reconciling these two worlds, these two realities, is a necessary part of that survivor being able to reintegrate and live in the actual world with other people in a just way. One of the things that allows for that reintegration to happen is for individuals and communities who have not done everything that they could do in order to prevent abuse, or perhaps have done things that enabled the abuse, to recognize and name the fact that that happened. Because that acts as kind of a bridge between this world where everybody has been living and this world over here where the survivor has been isolated. It's saying, yes, you know what, your experience of reality actually was true, and I am going to walk over this bridge and stand there with you. So it's not about, like I said, it's not about emotional kind of confession. It's not about the person doing the confession. It's about agreeing with survivors to create and affirm a reality that fully acknowledges the full scope of what that person experienced. So naming failures is something that I think you all have the power to do, and living into that power as a transformative power is something that I would recommend be on your agenda for your future conversations. In addition to naming failures, because the process can never end there, you all have the power to evaluate, to challenge, and to change habits and structures of your community that protect perpetrators. Not maybe intentionally so all the time, but for example, I've heard survivors say, when we meet, we need to not have meetings in hotel rooms. When we raise concerns in a small way, we need for those small concerns to be taken seriously so that there is space for larger concerns to be voiced. So doing some kind of an audit on what kind of seemingly innocuous parts of the culture of your community create roadblocks for survivors to name their experiences is something that you have the power to do. You can support the development of music and of worship that actively resists abuse. This is a special power that you have, and one that I am really excited about for you. You, with your gifts and talents, can write prayers that give teenagers and all people, but especially the young ones, the spiritual knowledge and power and resources to believe themselves when they feel in their bones during the grooming process that something isn't right. So you can create expressions of spirituality that give young people the tools to actually rise up and resist abuse as it's happening, rather than them feeling silenced by a theology that encourages them to be quiet. And you can step in and stop perpetrators. I said at the beginning of our time together that statistically it is likely that there are people who have committed acts of sexual violence among us. This is not a condemnation of this group. It is simply the world that we live in. It's true of us no matter where we are all the time. We know from reviewing we're still getting reports, so I actually can't tell you what the number of reports is at this point on abuse from Haas. But we know from analyzing those reports that the only time when Haas stopped was when people in positions of power, men in positions of power, stepped up and told him to in unequivocal terms. So you need to know that you actually do have power to stop abuses, and you have power to learn how to do it. We are very near the end of our time, so I would like to pause and hand it back over to Rory to decide whether we open some time for conversation or if you want to give instructions for next week.
How is your time, Dr. Scarsella?
I'm fine.
Okay, so my suggestion is that it's right about an hour and a half. Let me just make a couple of closing comments. And then if people want to leave or have to leave, feel free to do that. And then we'll just continue the conversation. And if you want to catch up later with the video version, you know, the recorded version. Does that sound okay to you, Dr.
Yes.
Scarsella? Are you okay?
Yep.
So, okay, so I don't want this to get away without at least acknowledging what a really enlightening and mind opening and I felt a very strong sense of being challenged and to sort of wake up. I heard, I mean, that's kind of been the whole pandemic time for me. But anyways, thank you so much for being so generous with us and offering to do this. That's what I'd like to say on behalf of all of us. And then to my friends that are still here, I'm going to send out shortly after this is over an email to all of you that has a copy of the, that will have a link to the Into Account, the 22-page Into Account report that came out earlier this week, in case you haven't seen it. And an invitation to prepare a 6-word memoir. The idea here is to, after you've read through it, just to sit with it. And this was Dr. Garrido's term, a 6-word memoir, a reaction to your listening and to your reading of the report, but no more than 6 words, so that next week we can have a place to begin a conversation with her about some of the things that we've talked about today and what is in that report. Secondly, an evaluation survey for this webinar with Dr. Scarsella is ready to go out via email right after the webinar. And of course, your steering committee would be very grateful if you would take a couple minutes and fill that out. Again, Dr. Scarsella, thank you. I invite anyone who needs to leave. Thank you for being here and go. And then anyone else who has questions, you go ahead and stick around, and Dr. Scarsella will answer it as long as we have people here or she's available to stay. I'm off now.
Thanks, Rory. Yeah, so those who would like to continue conversation, who have questions, who would like to make comments on the proposals that I just offered about the power you have in this moment to raise the level of solidarity with survivors, I welcome them.
Are you seeing Ricky Manalo's
Yeah,
piece there?
Ricky, go ahead.
Yeah,
there you
just
go.
Ricky.
Okay.
Hey, folks. Can you hear me?
Hi. Yes.
Yeah.
Hi. Thanks, Dr. Casella. I actually just wrote it down. I wasn't sure whether you saw my hand waving. Just to continue that last point, great point. I wonder if it might be helpful if you could provide helpful thoughts, suggestions as to how we go about stopping abuse. Let's say I see it happening during convention, or I see something, I walk past a hallway, as I've read actually in the report, and all of a sudden I might see something going on. What might you suggest for us? What actions I might take to go from there?
Well, I want to say that a lot of times for folks, one of the things that stops them from taking action in those scenarios is not knowing whether the person who is on the receiving end of the inappropriate behavior is experiencing it as inappropriate in the same way that they are. So I just want to acknowledge that is an anxiety that a lot of people feel. However, I would say trust your gut. If you see something that does not seem right, it is a very good idea to insert your presence in a way that remains respectful of the person who you are concerned about. let me just take some examples from things that I think folks could have intervened with Haas. So apparently he had a habit of being pretty touchy with folks. So it would be entirely appropriate and a very good idea for somebody to say to him, to confront him and say, you know, it's really not appropriate for you to touch people like that. You really need to ask people's permission before you touch them, or you really especially ought not to be so physically close with the teenagers who are approaching your camp, and here's why. And if he continues to behave like that, then I would escalate the confrontation and say, you know, you really need to change this. And if you don't, I'm going to get some more people involved. So a willingness to create uncomfortable situations is key for stopping abuse. And being educated enough that you can trust yourself, you can trust your instincts when you see an inappropriate situation, is a part of the process of stopping abuse as well. If you start to hear rumors that there may be something sexually inappropriate going on, I would suggest thinking really critically about where you can go to check in with anybody who might be harmed as a result of, you know, if the scenario you heard is true, if there's anything to it, who might be at risk here. Finding a way to check in with them and find out what, if anything, they would like you to do to intervene in the situation is a great idea. And also, if you know or suspect that sexual violence has happened, reporting it hopefully with the affirmation of the person most directly harmed would be a really great idea. But honestly, like, just asking a potential survivor, what can I do to support you and to affirm you going forward, opens up the door for a lot of creative options that I can't come up with on the spot here.
And there might be like resources, you know, that might help us, that might empower us more to take those steps. Vocabularies, knowing who's in charge of, if that's even appropriate, and you know, what kind of words and terms do we use, what kind of questions do we ask, and when.
Yes.
So,
And remember, try to challenge yourselves, I would say, to remember that our society teaches us that sexual violence is a personal problem. It's a personal violence. It's between one abuser and one survivor. That is a myth. And it's a part of the myth of rape culture. It's a part of the myth of our society that enables sexual violence to continue. Sexual violence is a community problem. And so when you are feeling like, oh, I'm interjecting myself into a situation, remind yourself that you are a part of the community in which this is happening, and therefore you have a responsibility as a community member to bear witness to the potential harm you are seeing. So perhaps begin by asking yourself, what does the responsible community member do in order to prevent violence in the most ethical way that they can? There are absolutely resources. I would first point you to the website for Faith Trust Institute. I'm gonna put that in the chat here. So Faith Trust Institute is an organization that has been working with community of faith for a long time on the issues of sexual and domestic violence. And on their website, they have a resources section that has a plethora of material, and you can find just about anything that you are looking for on their resources page. Into Account is also very happy to offer recommendations for directed resources if there's something specific that you're looking for.
thank you so much.
Others. What do you think about my suggestion of naming failures? I feel like that could be an uncomfortable one.
Can you hear me, Hilary?
Yes.
I was wondering if maybe you could speak a little bit to some of the things that I have heard either through social media, well, mostly through social media, that surely colleagues must have known about this behavior. And having worked so closely with David Haas over the years, what would be your response to this kind of talk?
Well, without knowing the details and without knowing the people and the circumstances, I don't think I'm in a position to make any kind of evaluation. So I'm going to zoom out a little bit and offer some general reflections on that subject. And there are really two sides that need to live together in the conversation. One of those sides is that it happens that a father sexually abuses his child daughter for years and the mother living in the house doesn't know. That happens. So we need to not underestimate the skill, especially of habitual serial sexual predators, in masking their behavior. That is very real and should be taken seriously. So I don't automatically think that everybody who was friends with Haas, everybody who was close to Haas absolutely knew what he was doing. On the other hand, a child who is sexually abused by her father for years without her mother's knowledge of it has a legitimate reason to be angry at her mother for not knowing about it. And there is an open question about whether the mother who didn't know about it because the perpetrator was actually skilled at hiding his behavior, or didn't know about it because allowing herself to come to consciousness about what was happening in front of her face would have destroyed her world, right? So knowledge is funny and strange. We have the ability as human beings to deny a reality that is right in front of our faces. And oftentimes our subconscious decision to deny that reality is in itself a form of our injustice and our complicity, because we are of a mindset and a worldview and a framework that is prioritizing our own comfort and our own ability to maintain relationship with the person who is being violent over the importance of being honest and open, even with ourselves, about the reality that is in front of our faces. So it's possible that the mother in the house genuinely didn't know. It is possible and much more likely that the mother in the house hadn't allowed the reality of the violence to come to her consciousness, but should have known, right? Like there were signs. If the mother had taken those signs seriously, she should have known. That's a different kind of complicity. That's a different kind of failure. And then it is also possible that people who do know lie and say that they didn't. And this is the situation that the Catholic Church has seen plenty of, particularly in contexts where there are groups of people who are abusive, groups of perpetrators who protect each other. And are willing to tell lies to cover for themselves and others. So I think the fact that the conversation is happening is fair, because all three of these situations do exist in the world, and it feels dangerous to not know which one of those situations that we're in. It takes a skilled, deep understanding of sexual violence to be able to discern your way toward truth and reality. And I think what is probably most important in this conversation is that no, that's not true. If there are people who really did know what was happening and chose not to do anything, that is a dramatic failure that needs to be named and dealt with. And some of you may know the theologian John Howard Yoder, peace theologian, Mennonite. I come from that tradition, and so was a part of everything that happened to uncover his abuses, which were very, very much like Haas's. Stanley Hauerwas was close to Yoder, and people were upset with him, saying, you had to have known, you have to have known. Stanley Hauerwas wrote an article a few years ago defending himself, explaining that he didn't know. And in the article, he wrote that, yes, a graduate student came to him and reported that he heard from someone else that abuse was happening. And yes, he knew that John Howard Yoder had very strange ideas about sexuality that didn't square with the broader ethics of what he was doing. And yes, right? Like, yes, I knew all these little things, but you can't blame me because I didn't know the full truth of what was happening. I wrote a response to Haas's article. And basically my response was, if someone came to you and told you they suspected violence and you decided not to follow up on that, you were choosing not to know, right? You made a choice to protect your knowledge from the truth. And if you are saying, I didn't know, and you are protecting that position because you didn't know the whole story, but you actually did have enough pieces to start to put it together, then you're also not telling us and not telling yourself the full truth about your knowledge. Because knowing is not a kind of act that is all or nothing. Now we have Into Accounts report. Now we all know something that we didn't know before. Every single one of the survivors who has come forward now knows so much more about the abuse that they themselves experienced because we have been able to collectively put together our knowledge and experiences. So there's always going to be more that you don't know. What is important is to take responsibility for what you did know and what you should have known. And responsibility doesn't mean, and now I'm going to regard myself as an awful person who should never show my face again. Responsibility means I have the spiritual maturity to be honest about my failures, to value that being honest is what is ethically important for the people most harmed, and to commit myself to making sure that these are not failures that I repeat in the future.
I've one more question, Hilary, is how do you speak to the whole role of, education? As leaders in ministry, we are technically, trained are supposed to be trained to spot these things, particularly with the focus on children in our diocese and our archdiocese in America. So as an adult, I've probably had more training ever than I had as, a young person, certainly as a teenager growing up in the 1980s.
Mm-hmm.
I certainly know that my own child is probably a lot more literate and educated in things like this than I ever was growing up. So in the span of time that we're looking at, can you speak maybe a little bit towards that in terms of where we are, even where our group might be today?
So are you asking, I'm sorry, I just want to clarify to make sure I understand. Are you asking about what does it mean that over the last few decades, our culture has changed when it comes to sexual violence and we have more knowledge now than we do before? Like, where does that leave people who were raised without this kind of knowledge?
Well, and how does that speak to our ability to even be accountable, or to have been accountable over the last number of decades toward even being able to spot potential signs without the education and the training for appropriate responses? Because as you've mentioned many times, the effect of trauma, or even the effect of the knowledge of a potential trauma, or the effect of, how reading about trauma can affect us in terms of being accountable to justice, and in a way that's merciful, that's forgiving, but yet promotes awareness and growth. I mean, I'm just thinking about myself, and over the last few decades in terms of how much more aware I am today of the potential, not only working with children, but working, with my peers, of boundaries. Whereas in the situations, certainly very often where we find ourselves as musicians and composers with concerts and events, over the decades, the awareness has increased. How can I be accountable for the times in the decades where we weren't so aware?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for clarifying that. Yeah, and maybe this is a good time for me to expand a little bit on what I mean when I say accountable. I really want to push us to step outside of a framework where accountability, rightness and wrongness, responsibility, etc., are primarily properties of individuals. What do I mean by that? If I need to, let's say I go to a Black Lives Matter protest, and in ignorance, I behave in a way that is racist, or that is perceived as such, or that is damaging to the organizers' goals. When I'm confronted about that, that confrontation isn't about my value as an individual. That confrontation is about how I am fitting in to a wide community process of transformation, accountability, and change. And so in that moment, one option would be for me to focus on, is it fair for you to have this criticism of me given the limitations of my knowledge? That focus would be, if I were to do that, I would be centering myself in the conflict. Because in my mind, what I would be putting my mental energy toward is trying to discern, did I do an okay thing or did I do a bad thing? Am I okay or am I bad? Am I good or am I bad? And I would be kind of caught in this temptation to center my engagement in defending my goodness. As if being revealed to have done something wrong is a challenge to my goodness. By my theology, it's not. By my theology, we are created beautiful by God. We are all going to mess up in ways that actually genuinely are unjust and really truly hurt other people. So when I am confronted about a way that I have fallen short, I think that is an opportunity for me, one, to learn about where I have room to grow. It's an opportunity for me to actually add to the justice of the situation by saying, by golly, you're right. Like, I actually did that completely wrong. Thank you for bringing that to my attention. And then I can reflect on why I did that wrong. Did I do it wrong because I didn't have the education, because I didn't have resources, because I grew up in a culture that didn't even recognize this type of violence as a thing? And the responsibility for my having behaved harmfully is on me, but it's also shared with my culture. My culture, my history, my people are responsible for not having prepared me to do right in this situation. And so it doesn't all need to be on my shoulders, and it doesn't need to mean that I am now forever kind of doomed and can't show my face. Rather, being able to be given the gift and the opportunity to affirm a survivor's perception that, yes, you are right, I did actually fail in that regard. Where do we go from here? Is a way that folks have power to use the incompleteness of their history, to use the kind of gaps in ethical awareness in their history, whether it's their fault or not, to add to the movement for justice and sexual violence rather than detract from it.
Thank you. Thank you.
I have a question here asking to address mandatory reporting laws for victims under 18. For example, in some states, there are various laws that suspected abuse of minor has to be reported within a certain framework of time. Yeah, I think it's really important to be aware of the laws in your locale, and it is important to follow them. Like I said, laws around sexual violence don't serve survivors very well, so there are all sorts of ethical glitches with that. But when it comes to minors, our general recommendation is that following mandatory reporting laws is what you should do. When you're dealing with an adult who can make their own decisions about how they want their experiences to be handled, it is important to get their consent. And when you are dealing with folks who are kind of at an age where it's really hard to make that determination, for example, when you're dealing with like 16 to 18, 15 to 18, because we all know that like a human being doesn't magically become some new kind of competent on their 18th birthday, then mandatory laws need to be held in tension with how you can follow those laws in a way that respects and preserves the agency of the child that you are calling on behalf of.
I would like to suggest, if there's not anyone else waiting to speak, that we bring this to a close because of other people's needs to leave, if that's good with you.
Sure.
Can I just say one more time, thank you on behalf of all of us for a really great 2 hours. I mean, it's like almost overload in my brain. Not almost. I can't even disentangle all my notes, but thank you for this. And if I can ask you for one more favor, could you send me the PowerPoint so that I can just give it out? Thanks very much.
I will absolutely do that. Thank you for inviting me into this space, and please do know that Into Account wants to support survivors' interests, and communities being informed and equipped to do right by survivors is in survivors' interests. So if there are ways that we can support you or your communities going forward, don't hesitate to reach out.
Thank you. And everybody, thank you for being here. We'll be talking more about this, I know. Okay, thanks a lot. Thanks,
Good
Dr.
evening.
Scarsella. Thank you.